Hello everyone, welcome to the 2025 Elakha Alliance Science Symposium. Happy to have you here today. We are going on to our third speaker. We are the Elakha Alliance hosting this symposium. My name is Chanel Hayson. I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations. Our mission is to make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast. Hence why we are talking a lot about sea otters today. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. We have Dr. Erin Foster, who is a postdoctoral research scientist with the Cetacean Research Program at Fisheries and Oceans Canada's Pacific Biological Station. She has 17 years of experience with sea otters and nearshore ecology and is interested in restoring the ecological interactions that have been lost or modified where keystone species are reduced. So thank you, Erin, for joining us today, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, thanks. That comes up okay, Chanel?
Yes, beautiful photo.
It's not mine, but thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the role of sea otters in seagrass and salt marsh communities. But I always like to start out by talking about sea otters and kelp, especially after Matt's great talk. And so I think many of us listening today, and many of us, the way we've grown up and thought about sea otters, has really been to consider them as a kelp forest species. I've almost thought of them as like a kelp forest obligate species. Most of the places I've seen them have been kelp forest and rocky reef environments and sort of outer shores, outer coast environments close to shore. And this didn't really change for me until I was working on my PhD, and it was this great paper that came out called Are the Ghosts of Nature's Past Haunting Ecology Today? And the whole premise of this paper was this idea that when we're studying an animal that was really heavily harvested, which is a lot of predators that we work on, a lot of herbivores too, but a lot of predators have historically been very heavily harvested either to control their impacts on prey or for oil or for fur. And so what this paper talked about was that once a huge harvest like that has happened, particularly if it happens before the scientific study of that species is very developed, which also has been the case with most of these animals, then what we come into the world and see when we begin scientific study, in the case where the species recovers enough to be studied, what we're looking at isn't really necessarily normal. We kind of assume it's normal, but it's coming with this whole context of these really heavy harvests. And in the case of sea otters in particular, this seemed to be part of the reason why, as scientists, it took us a while to really appreciate the roles of sea otters in eelgrass and salt marsh systems. And so it wasn't really until 2013 that the first study of otters in eelgrass came out. And by the first study, I mean the first study that looked at a trophic cascade that affected the plants themselves. People had looked at otters in other places, not only in kelp forests, obviously. And as we've started to get a bit deeper into the literature and more interdisciplinary literature, so in this case, I'm talking about working with archaeologists and ethnographers to learn more about what coastal ecosystems may have looked like well before the fur trade in thousands of years before present. What's really come to light is that a lot of these archaeological sites, even ones that are really far away from a rocky reef or kelp forest supporting habitats, a lot of these middens and archaeological assemblages are showing evidence of sea otter harvests that were potentially made over these estuary type environments. And it might be the case that part of our delay for really looking into this was that during the maritime fur trade, these more sheltered habitats were easily harvested. And when the fur trade ended, the large majority of sea otter colonies that we were able to go out and study were still occurring in those places that were very hard to reach for hunters. But it seems that in the past, they were present in estuaries and eelgrass systems. And when you think about the coevolution of sea otters and the habitats in which they reside, we know that nearshore habitats have supported Zostra marina, so eelgrass, for over 2 million years throughout the Pacific Rim. And we know that sea otters have existed in the Pacific Rim for at least 700,000 years. And so taking those together, we might consider that the effects of sea otters in eelgrass communities and also in salt marsh communities have perhaps been overlooked a little bit and perhaps are really important. And if they're not important, it's still worth trying to understand how the sea otter functions in these habitats and how it might influence the different community players in these habitats. And so in this book chapter that Brent and I co-authored, we really tried to use it as a space to consider how the fur trade has shaped our understanding of sea otters in these areas. And other than this sort of brief background, I probably won't dig into that too much. I think Jim gave a big overview of this concept in the morning. We had a bit of an emergency over here on the island, so I didn't get to hear his talk. And what I'm really going to focus on is the role of sea otters in these communities today. And from that role of sea otters, how the recovery of sea otters can actually support some aspects of ecological restoration in seagrass and salt marsh communities. So I want to talk first about what we've learned about otters in these areas sort of to date and give you a bit of a review of what's known in the literature. And I just want to re-emphasize that the first published account of how sea otters affect eelgrass was made by Brent Hughes and colleagues, and that was in 2013. So that's only 12 years ago. So by contrast, the first real account of the sea otter cascading effects in kelp forest systems was made in 1974. So it took 39 years for this to start coming to light. And part of that was just the way that sea otters recover to different areas. What Brent found in Elkhorn Slough was really groundbreaking at the time. And I was just about to get my PhD started when I first met Brent, and he was telling me about this. And he was super influential on my direction, and I remember a lot of sit downs with him and Jim Estes while I was down in California, really trying to figure out where we could go with sea otters in eelgrass systems, what we could study next. And what Brent had just discovered was that where sea otters had moved into a fairly closed seagrass system in the Elkhorn Slough, a really eutrophic system. So this area is often referred to as the breadbasket of California. I would argue maybe the breadbasket of much of North America and further. A lot of food's grown in and around that area. And the slough gets all the runoff from all that agricultural effort and a ton of fertilizer. And so the slough can get really thick with nutrients and algae. And some of those algae grow on top of the eelgrass blades. And what happens when an eelgrass blade is covered in algae, and I'll call it epiphytes over and over again. So anyone who doesn't know what an epiphyte is, that's just a plant growing on a plant. So these epiphytes kind of smother the seagrass, and you can see that in the bottom picture there at Tamales Bay, how that eelgrass all looks kind of fuzzy. And so what Brent found was where sea otters were established in the slough and eating crabs, they were releasing this little green sea slug and little isopods that aren't pictured here from predation. And that was allowing these guys to clean off the eelgrass blades. They eat epiphytes. That let the eelgrass photosynthesize better, and it did a lot better where otters were present. I've just got another slide image here to help you understand that. So on the left, there's a whole bunch of crabs. There's not very many sea slugs and isopods, and the eelgrass is covered in epiphytes. And on the right, we've got sea otters limiting crabs. That's releasing these little mesograzers, they're called. You just think of them as grazers for the point of this. It's releasing these little grazers from crab predation, and it's letting them crawl all over the eelgrass and eat the diatoms off of it. So the eelgrass does much better where sea otters are present than it does where they're absent. The big challenge Brent faced after publishing this was how general was it? Was this just like a unique effect of sea otters on a eutrophic and fairly closed eelgrass system? And by closed, I mean literally it's almost closed. So the slough is this body of water with a narrow gap that opens it out to the outer coast. And so when sea otters are in there, they're often spending most of their time in the slough. There's not a ton of back and forth to the outer waters and the nutrients and things like that. There's not a huge amount of flushing as compared to, say, something like Monterey Bay. And so together we tried to replicate Brent's study, or at least aspects of it, in different parts of the sea otter's range. And so we first started replicating it in British Columbia. I was working at the Hakai Institute at that time. We had a big push to measure the same ecosystem constituents that Brent had measured and see if we could pick up the same effect of otters. And this study was also replicated throughout Southeast Alaska, mostly by Wendell, who did an amazing job with it. And what we found was, well, it was really confusing, actually. We couldn't quite figure out what was going on because some parts of what Brent had found in elkhorn sloughs seemed to hold throughout the range and some parts didn't. And so a PhD student in 2021 published this great study that sort of took all of us in all the areas we were working in and added some more areas and data sets and did sort of a coast-wide examination all at once with the data. And what he found was incredibly interesting to me. So he found that in all 4 of the sites in California, I guess it's really 2 because they're paired. So in the 2 sites with otters and the 2 sites without otters in California, the trophic cascade held, and so did the dynamics between the otters and the crabs and the grazers and the eelgrass. But in the San Juans, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska, the only part that really held was this connection between higher eelgrass biomass where sea otters are present and lower eelgrass biomass where they weren't. And so this was really perplexing. And generally, otters were limiting crabs in BC and Alaska, just like they do elsewhere in their range. But this mesograzer link to eelgrass wasn't really there, not with the same sort of strength or predictability that Brent and his colleagues were finding in California. And I think we're still working on figuring out why, but after reviewing a lot of this literature and working together with a lot of us that have been collecting the data and looking into it, a few things have really come to light. And even though I've hashed out these diagrams, I want you to notice that the 2 mesograzers that are really important in elkhorn slough are this sea slug Phyllosplegia and this isopod Idodia. And in BC and Alaska, the mesograzer guild has a lot more species in it, and often all those species have been mixed together. And I'm just going to zoom in on these 2 species for a minute. One thing that we found with the sea hare here is that in the studies in California, the individual size, and this is a nice one to follow up with Matt's talk, but the individual size of these sea hares in California, they're like big fat banana slugs. And up in BC, they're sometimes like moderately fat banana slugs, but more often they're quite a bit smaller. And it happened that in the meadows where people were looking for this trophic cascade, the Phyllosplegia was generally quite rare, and where it was present, it was quite small. And that appeared to happen sort of on a gradient of it getting smaller and less common the further north we proceeded with testing this idea. And so this really honed in for Brent and I, and probably others too, that this one mesograzer Phyllosplegia is really important in this grazing relationship. And if you look at that picture, it probably shouldn't surprise you that I just said that. Like, this animal has clearly adapted to live on an eelgrass blade and move up and down the blade and just clean the epiphytes off the blade. That is how it makes its living. It's not really doing a huge diversity in foraging behavior or collecting things out of the water column. It is literally running its sort of sandpapery tongue along an eelgrass blade and cleaning it. The other thing that I thought was really cool was a colleague of mine at Hakai did a feeding study of all the different mesograzers that they had looked at when they were testing this relationship. But what she found was that this isopod, Idatia, which was really instrumental in the trophic cascades that were revealed in California, well, where we live, it's eating kelp detritus. And when you think about the shoreline complexity in BC and Alaska, we have a lot of like fringing, we call them fringing meadows or like outer coast meadows, but for us where the coastline's really complex, we can have these really small meadows and these little fringing meadows, and these meadows that are occurring actually really close to rocky reef environments, really close to kelp forest environments, and they're really influenced, and Angeline showed that in this paper, that these eelgrass meadows, their whole community structure and the production in the meadows is really heavily influenced by kelp production. And so where we were looking for this trophic cascade, Idatia, the key player in California, was eating a lot less of the epiphytes and a lot more of the kelp. So, and I'm sorry, I should have explained this graph right away. They're kind of confusing, these graphs, but the main thing I want you to look at is this bottom axis here. And 0.6 is about 60% of the diet. So Idatia is eating over half its diet is kelp detritus. And where you get a bunch of hills all overlapped like this, it means you can't really tell these other prey types apart. So this is an isotope study. So isotopically, the epiphytes growing on seagrass and a thin-celled algae named ulva, we couldn't really tell those apart, or Angeline couldn't tell them apart. I wasn't involved in this study. I wouldn't have been able to tell them apart either, though. But the kelp here, this kelp signature was really strong. So this was a bit of an aha moment for us that even the same species, they're not necessarily doing the same things, even at these lower trophic levels in these ecological communities that we're trying to compare. And that's something that kelp ecologists have been dealing with for a really long time. And I'm sure Matt went through a lot of this already. I was a bit late for his talk too, but that these functional roles of the different players in these ecological communities can really differ across that north to south gradient and among these different coastlines, between sort of the straighter coastlines of California, Oregon, Washington, and these more wiggly, convoluted coastlines up where the glaciers used to come down. So the take home from those few slides is really that across the range, sea otters were limiting crabs, but the mesograzers weren't really affecting eelgrass, and they were sometimes, but not always, affected by the limiting of crabs. So the other thing that otters eat a lot of, especially up in BC and Alaska, is clams. And in some parts of their range, the diet can be 90% clam-based throughout the year. And so we started to wonder if there might be some sort of a link between eating clams and the effects we were seeing in eelgrass biomass, because the positive correlation between otters and eelgrass biomass was feeling pretty clear, but just this mechanism was really hard to sort of guess at. And we know again from Rocky Shores research and Outer Coast research that sea otters do more than eat. And I mean, they eat a lot, but while they're eating, there's these other effects that happen. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And so what's well established for mussel beds is that when otters come in to feed on mussels, they'll sort of like grab a clump of mussels, and sometimes they work the swell to get the mussels off the rock. They'll often come up with a big clump of mussels on their chest. And unfortunately, this photo doesn't show that. It just shows a huge single mussel. But you can see in this picture of the mussels on the rocks, all these bare patches. And these bare patches can be created when otters rip mussels off the rocks. And in intertidal communities, a lot of things can limit species abundance and where species can settle out and grow. And one of the big limitations can be space. And so when you have otters in a system and they're ripping mussels off the rocks, it's opening up space for larval recruits of a variety of other species to settle out in the rocks and grow. So when otters are eating clams, they're digging these big pits. So I just want to draw your attention to the two landscape photos here. So on the top, I've got sort of a bare sandy substrate so that the pits are really obvious to us looking at them. So an otter comes in and it digs clams out of these pits. And that's happening in eelgrass too. And so Brent and his colleagues wondered if there was something going on whereby otters removing clams could perhaps clear some space for eelgrass to grow better. Perhaps around the edge of an eelgrass meadow, if you dug all the clams up, the meadow could then expand. And perhaps in the middle of a meadow, it could affect how eelgrass is growing. And so Brent and his students did transplant experiments throughout parts of Southeast Alaska, and they took eelgrass plants from areas with and without otters or with high and low sea otter prevalence and moved them around. And what they found, we'll look at this left one first. So on the bottom, we've got the otter treatments, and I put these big goofy pictures in to make it really obvious. So where otters were absent or low, the edible clam biomass underground was significantly higher than where otters were present. And anybody that studied otters for any length of time wouldn't be surprised by this. We know that otters limit clams. What was really cool that went along with this is that where eelgrass was transplanted to areas with low sea otters and high clams, it didn't grow very fast. And it grew significantly faster in areas where there were a lot of otters and fewer clams. And so from this, the following conclusions were made, and that was that the mechanism through which sea otters are increasing the biomass of eelgrass, where the crab mesograzer is breaking down, there's this other effect happening. So otters are pulling clams out of the ground, and that's providing space for eelgrass rhizome growth. And that eelgrass growth rates were faster where otters were established and slower where otters were absent. And this picture is a really extreme pit. So we're looking at a pit. An otter had just come in and dug up geoduck from this pit. But I'm just showing it here, and generally they're not digging huge geoducks out of eelgrass meadows. It's possible, it has happened, but it's not the most common clam that's getting pulled out of these meadows. Geoducks are usually deeper than eelgrass, at deeper water depths than eelgrass grows at usually. But what you can really see here, these are tube worms, and they've just been, this mat of tube worms has really been ripped up with this pit. So at the same time as Brent and his colleagues were working on this clam question up in Southeast Alaska, my colleagues and I in BC were wondering what kind of effects this digging disturbance is having on the plant itself. And in my case, I wasn't really thinking so much about the clam removal, and it is really important, and it's a really cool aspect, but I was thinking more from the perspective of the eelgrass's life history traits. And most plants, if they're disturbed, if they're stressed out, they start to flower and produce pollen and seeds. And it's a pretty standard plant response to stress. You might notice it in your own gardens in the summer. If you're doing like a really good job gardening, sometimes the flowers don't come out very well, and then you forget and go camping and your plants get all stressed out, and you come home and everything's bloomed, and you think, oh, that's interesting. Well, that's your plant worrying that it's about to die, and so in the face of imminent death, it needs to reproduce to get its genes out into the ecosystem. And this is a picture of me just snorkeling in an eelgrass meadow, and that sort of shaded spot here in the picture is a sea otter pit. So otters have been through this meadow digging clams. You can see how like broken up the meadow is in places. It's got all these bald patches, and so this was a meadow that was fairly recently occupied by sea otters. And I'm just looking in the middle of this pit, and I want to know if the seedling that's under my hand that you can't see in the photo, I'm trying to figure out if its little roots are attached to the other plants, or if it was like a seed that came off a plant and settled out somewhere different. And this is important because eelgrass can reproduce in two different ways, and a lot of plants can do this. Redwoods are a classic example in California. So eelgrass can reproduce vegetatively. So we're going to look at the bottom of this graph first. And when it's reproducing vegetatively, all that really means is it's sending out roots. They're called rhizomes. I'll call them roots because that's a bit simpler for different people tuning in. But they like stretch their roots out underground and more shoots come up. And there are some really big eelgrass meadows out in the world, especially out in the Mediterranean, where they're many hectares in size, and they're all the same clone. So when you're reproducing vegetatively, the entire meadow, every piece of eelgrass in it, can have the exact same genetic makeup as everybody else in the meadow. And generally in plants, this type of clonal reproduction is favored when conditions are stable. So selection favors the same genotype that worked last year, that worked the year before, that worked the year before that, because that genotype works. When you live in an environment that has more disturbance or is less predictable, selection tends to favor sexual reproduction. And obviously in sexual reproduction, you've got the mixing of two individuals of the same species, and that mutation and crossing over that can happen at the chromosome level. And so in the case of eelgrass and many other plants, it can do both. And so I took this idea together with the idea that plants under stress might do more flowering. And then there was this really cool paper that came out that looked at eelgrass. I think this was done off Washington. It's funny, I can't remember that off the top of my head. I think it was Washington though, and it was an intertidal recreational clam fishery. And what these authors found was when people came out and did their recreational clam digging, the eelgrass reproduced by producing flowers and seeds. And it invested far more energy in that type of reproduction when it was disturbed. So you can sort of see that in these bar plots. The shoot density would go down and the reproductive effort would go up, and more flowers and seeds, more sexual reproduction, less asexual, clonal, vegetative. Those all mean the same thing in this context. Less of that kind of reproduction. And so we tested this in meadows that had established sea otter populations or no or very recently arriving sea otter populations. And we got quite lucky with this because we found in the two different areas that we looked at, we had slightly different genetic populations of eelgrass, but that within each one of those populations, where otters were established, which is the red, all the red in here, the genetic diversity and the genotypic diversity was significantly greater than where otters were not established. And we think that's because otters were creating these conditions that really favored sexual reproduction. And this is important in terms of conservation, and this together with Jessica Saavedra's work with the space limitation is really important for conservation, because those are creating conditions for these seeds to settle out and grow. And having a higher genetic diversity, it's kind of like buying a bunch of lottery tickets. You've got a whole bunch of plants, and each one who's got a different genetic makeup is like a different lottery ticket in that eelgrass meadow. And so if conditions change, then presumably somebody in that meadow is going to be, just by chance, better adapted to the change. Whereas if everybody's the same and a big ecological change happens, something like climate change maybe comes at it, maybe the whole meadow gets wiped out because nobody's well suited. And I think one of the things that neither Jessica nor I could really test in what we were doing was this idea about the pits making space for eelgrass seedings and helping create the conditions that were suitable for a seedling to grow up. So if you look in this left panel where there's no otters, the eelgrass meadow can be really thick. And so the meadow might be smaller and thicker than a meadow that has otters in it. So if plants were producing sexually here and their seeds were released, there's actually nowhere for that seed to really land and get established. It just kind of falls into this rhizome mat and gets outcompeted by these big clones that are already established. Whereas when you've got otters digging digging pits and disturbing the meadow and removing clams that are preventing rhizomes from spreading, you create this space for a seedling to settle out, and eelgrass seeds can travel quite far. And the other thing that we think these pits might do is, like, I don't know how many people who are listening have done any scuba diving inside an eelgrass meadow, but often if you're snorkeling or diving in a meadow, you'll see those pits collect things. And so that means they could collect a seed, and also that the seed isn't going to be whisked off in current or through any kind of wave action. It's sort of in this like sheltered little nest where it can start its roots and start getting itself established. And obviously it's got more access to sunlight when it's in a small clearing like that. So that's sort of a rundown on what we've learned about otters in seagrass communities over the past 12 years or so. And you'll see from that there's like a lot still that can be done, particularly, I think, particularly in these functional roles of the different species that live in eelgrass communities and how those functional roles vary from place to place. The other part of this chapter and what I'm talking about today is about sea otters and their behavior in salt marshes. And so this is something, again, that the scientific literature on this has really just begun, and it's really begun in Elkhorn Slough. We have huge tidal marshes like this up the coast, huge, we call it sea asparagus up here. I think most Americans call it pickleweed, Spartina. It produces these big marsh areas, and as sea otters have become more established in Elkhorn Slough, they've expanded up into the upper reaches of the slough, where they're feeding in these tidal flats when the tide is up, obviously. So they're in these little channels. I'll just go back for a sec. So the otters are swimming around in these little channels, and they're feeding on little crabs primarily in these channels. And so from this graph, I just want to draw your attention to the timeline on the bottom and have you notice that otters sort of expanded in around 2015, 2016. And what was noticed when otters came in, and so what we're looking at in this picture is sort of a side cut of these walls. So if you can imagine, like, looking in along the side here in this shaded area of the channel, or up along this. And where there's no otters, there's all these holes in the substrate. And this is really destabilizing the shoreline where those tidal channels are coming through, and it's causing a lot of erosion. So these burrows go deep into the sediment, and there's a little bit of water moving up and down and filling those burrows. It destabilizes the muck that's holding the marsh together, and it all just caves in to the water. And so these channels were really eroding, and the salt marsh habitat itself was really eroding. And I don't think it was quite realized how unnatural that was, because otters had been absent for so long. But as otters came back, scientists started to notice that the salt marsh was doing a lot better. And so what Brent and his colleagues found when they really dug into this was that, again, otters are limiting an invertebrate. This time it's a burrowing shore crab. And so not only are shore crabs burrowing those tunnels, but they're also going in, check out those big chelae. They're big pinchers. They're going in, and they're just, you can think of these as little pruning shears. They're just like pruning, shearing off the tops of the plants, and they're going in and pruning, shearing off the bottom. So they're digging holes in the sediment, and then they're removing the roots that kind of glue the shoreline together through the muck. And together those effects, the burrows and the reduction of the plant biomass, are causing this erosion. And what Brent and his colleagues found was that on the bottom here, we've got the number of sea otters, and then on the y-axis here, we've got the erosion rate. That erosion rate steeply dropped as the number of otters feeding in those salt marsh habitats increased. And this part hasn't been tested yet, but this is another idea about the interactions that sea otters are having in salt marshes. But in this slide, I first want to make a note of this really cool ecological note that came out in Ecology in 2017. And this was a note to say that in recent years, the authors had noticed a high proportion of sea otters hauling out on the salt marsh. And so sea otters do haul out, depending on where you're working, you can see them hauled out a lot. We've seen rafts of hundreds of animals hauled out. Where I work, we usually see that in winter when it's cold. In California, it sounds like they often haul out when it gets really hot, and Elkhorn Slough certainly gets hot. Whatever the cause, a lot of otters are hauling out in the slough. And when they haul out, researchers have noticed that the sea asparagus, the pickleweed, seems to be doing better. Like, it seems like it's being fertilized. It seems greener and happier. And you can see here this little depression outlined in white in the bottom panel from an otter that's hauled out. And one of the theories about this is whether or not there's some nutrient transfer happening from otters hauling out and defecating and urinating on the marsh itself, and whether that is additionally helping the pickleweed. So I'm just going to work on wrapping up here because I'm getting close to the end of my time. So there's a lot of different ecological interactions that we think are linked to sea otters in seagrass and salt marsh communities. And some of them are fairly well fleshed out, and a lot of them are still pretty preliminary. And so I really do want to reiterate here that compared to kelp forest ecology, the way that sea otters may or may not structure and alter the function of communities is a lot more poorly understood. Like, we're still in the infancy of our understanding of how this works and how it might have worked in the past. But of the interactions that we think are occurring, some of them are trophic due to eating, and some of them are due to this digging disturbance. And I think that's an important direction for the future, to start thinking about sea otters as more than just a big metabolism that's eating things. They're coming in and digging. They do a lot of digging, and they can really change. Not only just the biomass of clams, but there's some early work from Rick Kvitek that talks about how when otters are digging clams, if there's lots of big clams available, they're leaving little clams behind, but they've dug the pit, right? So clams of all sizes are in the pit. And now those little clams are just left out at the top, and that could support crabs, and that could support Pycnopodia. Just the example that Rick uses in his paper. There's some really cool ethnographic literature that I don't have time to get into today, but there's ethnographic literature that shows how people harvest eelgrass rhizomes. And one of the ideas around those harvest methods from indigenous people, harvested for many thousands of years and still do in some places, is that the shape and action of the specialized digging stick that was used it's like a long stick that you'd put into the rhizome mat, and you would twist the stick, and that would kind of twirl the rhizomes or the roots up around your stick, and you pull that out. That action was really aerating the soil and making it far better for eelgrass. So more free oxygen molecules, more bacterial action, more breaking down of nutrients, and those things together helped eelgrass growth. So if you've ever walked on an eelgrass flat and it's really stinky, really smells like sulfur, that's a meadow that's not getting turned over at all. But if you're walking around on eelgrass meadows that are well turned over by sea otters or by people digging rhizomes, the substrate is more sort of fluffy and aerated, and the plants seem to do better. That's something we haven't tested for sea otters, and it hasn't been tested for people either, but I think it's perhaps a next step. Anyways, so what we know is that sea otters increase eelgrass photosynthesis when they're in eutrophic areas, that sea otters indirectly increase eelgrass biomass They can do this by limiting crabs and by limiting clams. That increased eelgrass growth could perhaps be occurring to bioturbation or clam removal or both. That sea otters digging in eelgrass increases the genetic diversity of the plant, which in turn increases its resilience and provides these conditions that favor sexual reproduction and seed settlement and growth. And that sea otters are reducing salt marsh erosion through the regulation of burrowing crabs. And they might also increase some of the plant growth in the salt marsh by fertilizing the plants. And so I think that even though all of these interactions haven't been tested everywhere for generality yet, that it's worth considering incorporating sea otters in seagrass and salt marsh restoration efforts. And I know this is occurring in Morro Bay, where sea otters have been considered in meadow expansion. And something I didn't really get into in this talk was just the importance of these ecological communities, and particularly as we face bigger wave action and changes due to climate change along the shorelines. These eelgrass and salt marsh habitats are super important. So they're helping to stabilize the shoreline, which is going to be really important as storm surges increase. And they've got a huge role in storing carbon dioxide. And so they're reducing the types of greenhouse gases that can increase climate warming. They nurture fish and birds. I think most people know that. They provide a great nursery habitat for young fish. We have salmon coming out of the rivers. Work that's been done in BC has, I think it showed about a 4-fold growth rate in young salmon that stayed in estuaries, as opposed to those that had to head out into more exposed nearshore waters right away. And they make big stopover sites. We've got huge populations of geese that stop in and feed in eelgrass meadows across North America. They can absorb pollutants. There's a really cool study that looked at a community that wasn't able to clean their waste. So they were using the bathroom in the intertidal area. And where eelgrass was present, there was very little rate of E. coli and other bacteria. And where there was no eelgrass, the water was getting incredibly contaminated and people were getting sick. And eelgrass can affect the coastal economy by supporting the fish and shellfish that become fisheries as they age into harvest size. And I think even though this is a Sea Otter Day and my talk is obviously centered around sea otters, that they're just one predator that's kind of been through this. And so I just want to take a minute, and this study by Jim Estes and colleagues was also super influential on the way I think about the world. But I really want to get back to that idea between this study and that Ghosts of the Past study that some of these consumers really truly change the ecosystem and the function of the different players in the ecosystem. And we see this time and time again. We see this in freshwater systems. We see it in intertidal systems. We see it in seagrass and kelp forest systems. We see it in Arctic island systems. We see it in jungles. And when we talk about species extinctions and species conservation, I think a lot of times the general public, and maybe a lot of scientists too, a lot of times the worry that we share is about this one species. Like, oh no, there's no otters left, and otters are so cute, and I want to see an otter. But what's really a lot more important than just the species is all the interactions that it has in these systems that it lives in. And I think for so many animals, and again, the sea otter is just one example, where they've been hunted to near oblivion, we don't know what those interactions are unless they recover. And for a lot of animals, they don't get a chance to recover. And so not only do we lose a species, but we lose all these ecological interactions. And then we look at an ecosystem and we don't really understand the function because we're missing the major evolutionary players that shaped those functions. And to end that on a more positive note, I think that that's really for me anyways, it's really why I like studying sea otters. They're recovering, and so there's all this space to look at what seem to be new interactions, but then to start wondering, is this really new, or is this how it was supposed to be working for the past 200 years since the fur trade? And how could these interactions help us today, particularly in the face of climate change? So I just want to come back to my acknowledgement slide here. I want to acknowledge everyone who's contributed to the work that Brent and I were able to weave together in our chapter. I think if Brent was giving this talk, he would say the same as me, which is just that Jim Estes was a huge mentor to both of us and hugely instrumental in focusing both of us on these eelgrass systems. And I hope that between Brent and I and others working in eelgrass, we can really build a bit more of a groundswell of ecologists that are interested in looking at the effects of sea otters in these systems. And so I can take some questions too. I'll just stop the screen share.
That was amazing, Erin. Thank you so much. I use a lot of Brent's work in my presentations to talk about the importance of sea otters in estuaries. And we've got a couple questions for you about that. So Alexa asked, does the genetic diversity of eelgrass also help sea otters and other species success?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yes. Does the genetic diversity of eelgrass also help sea otters and other species in their success rate?
I think it does. I mean, again, like I don't want to overstate it, because in some conditions, like the Mediterranean, where the environment's really stable, these clonal eelgrass meadows have persisted for hundreds or thousands of years. In some cases, the clones are really old. So I don't want to say that clonal strategy never works. If it never worked, it wouldn't be a strategy, it would just be selected against. But what genetic diversity does is makes the meadow as a whole more likely to get lucky in different situations and persist. So for example, when we had that big heat wave, if all the meadows were clones and the clones didn't happen to be well suited to a heat wave, the whole meadow could wipe out. And obviously that's got a major consequence for every species that relies on that habitat complexity and productivity of an eelgrass meadow. So sort of a roundabout way, I'm not really answering your question. I would say yes, genetic diversity generally increases benefits to everyone, but with the caveat that sometimes clones are selected for, and I don't want to ignore that. Doesn't seem to be the case where we live.
Okay, I've got another question for you. Has there been any work done looking into otters' impact on invasive green crabs in eelgrass meadows and therefore potentially relieving pressure on clams in these same ecosystems?
Absolutely. Definitely otters are eating green crabs, and they're limiting green crabs in some places. I might be, Sean or Jim or Bob, feel free to hop in if you know of a paper that's come out about that recently, but nothing is jumping to mind other than foraging studies that I know of that are in progress.
Okay. Another question for you from Crystal. Past research has looked at kelp's ability to absorb CO2 increases with the presence of otters. I know at the beginning you shared otters' presence in eelgrass beds increases their health, but do we know how much more CO2 they may be able to absorb with their presence?
So I think Chris Wilmer's study on kelp was linked to otters because otters were producing kelp. I think that per gram of kelp, the carbon sequestration doesn't change whether otters are present or not. I think that link is that otters are making kelp. I'd have to go back and read it again to be sure. Similarly for eelgrass, if otters are increasing growth rates of eelgrass, which they appear to be, then eelgrass is going to sequester more CO2 faster because that sequestration is happening while it's growing. It's part of the way the plants respirate, and by absorbing the CO2 and incorporating into their tissues, that's how that's getting pulled out of the atmosphere. So I think wherever otters increase the biomass of a plant, then otters are having a positive effect on their increasing CO2 sequestration. In the case of eelgrass, it might be that eelgrass sequesters more when otters are there because the growth rates change. I'm not sure if the growth rates of kelp are changing.
Thank you for that. I know in the chat we've got thanks, Andy, for sharing the paper on how sea otters impact European green crabs, the invasive green crabs. I believe
Oh,
it's,
great.
is it 50,000 or 20,000 to 150,000 annually are eaten per otter per year in the Elkhorn Slough. I guess you can look through that and make sure that I got my numbers right, but a very big impact on the invasive green crab species, which would be really great because we also have those here in Oregon. So potentially
Mm.
that could help impact or lessen the impact of those invasive species on our ecosystem. Megan had a comment. She said, thanks for bringing up the digging stick that Indigenous people use. She's been making observations about how digging sticks were used to dig up camas and other tubers in meadows, and how that emulates the beneficial soil disturbance that bears create. So super fascinating
Oh, cool.
that. We also had several comments in the chat. Ron said, great presentation, tying in so many factors together. And thanks for having it's really cool to look at the effects of otters in ways that I haven't considered before from Crystal.